thank you all for being here. Those of you who are joining online and here in person, we're really excited to welcome you for this event. We've been really looking forward to this. I just wanted to start with a quick introduction before introducing our special guests. So my name is Alana Ojibwe. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law School. The Center for Justice Reform aims to empower students to transform the ways we respond to harm and pursue justice, both within our local communities and beyond. It's through events like this that I believe some of the most enriching learning happens. It's through hearing the knowledge and experiences from practitioners and those with lived experience, and through dialogue within community itself to think deeply and intentionally about the ways these topics and ideas can get put into practice. So it looks like we have a mix of students, both in person and joining online. We have students in our program who are around the country and those who are here in Vermont, as well as a mix of some staff and some faculty. So thank you all here for joining us. I just want to make a really quick housekeeping note so that you all know what to expect. And then I'll jump in to some introductions. So just really briefly want to share, we'll start with a presentation from our three special guests, give about 30 to 40 minutes for them to speak. And then we'll have a couple panel questions for each of them, and then we'll open it up for community discussion and question and answer. As you'll see for those who are in person, the printed photographs that are part of this book are hung up around the room. As well as there's 2 copies of the book that are circulating around. So feel free to look through that while the presentation is happening. And if you have any questions, just know if you want to write that down or take note of it somewhere, we will have a time for questions. But we'll start with the presentations themselves. So again, thank you 3 so much for joining us today. We're really, really looking forward to hearing from you. Have been really moved and inspired by your work and your experiences. So just want to really quickly introduce, we have Barb Toews, who is an associate professor in criminal justice at the University of Washington, Tacoma. In addition to empirical and theoretical journal articles, she's co-author with Howard Zehr of Learning from Life, 22 Lifers 25 Years Later, Critical Issues in Restorative Justice, and is also the author of the Little Book of Restorative Justice for People in Prison, and is a current series editor of the Little Book of Justice and Peacebuilding series. Her research focuses on relationships among restorative justice, environmental design, and psychosocial, behavioral, judicial, and trauma healing outcomes for people who have been harmed, people who cause harm, and justice practitioners. For 2 decades prior to becoming faculty, Barb held leadership positions in restorative justice and criminal justice nonprofit organizations. This included 2 community-based victim offender dialogue programs, as well as an agency that advocated and provided services for incarcerated people and their families, through whom she developed and facilitated restorative justice programs in collaboration with incarcerated men and women. She's an experienced victim offender dialogue facilitator in both nonviolent and violent crimes. Next, we have Howard Zehr. Howard began as a practitioner and theorist in restorative justice in the late 1970s at the foundational stage of growth within the criminal justice field. He has led hundreds of events in more than 25 countries, 35 states, including trainings and consultations on restorative justice, victim offender dialogue conferencing, judicial reform, and other criminal justice matters. Zehr was an early advocate of making the needs of victims central to the practice of restorative justice. A core theme in his work is respect and dignity for all people. As a prolific writer and editor, speaker, educator, and photojournalist, Zehr has continued to actively mentor other leaders in the field through courses, workshops in restorative justice, and through his work at the Zehr Institute of Restorative Justice at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, Eastern Mennonite University. And last but certainly not least, we have Freddie Nole, who's a contributor featured in this first book, Doing Life, which was published in 1996, as well as the current book, which is the one circulating around, and you'll see the photos, Still Doing Life, which was published in 2022. These books capture a glimpse into the lives and stories of individuals like Freddie, who have embarked on a continuous journey of their own sense of purpose and healing, despite the many confines and challenges experienced by those enduring the reality of a life sentence. Freddie has served 49 plus years in prison after being sentenced at age 17. He was released in 2019 as a result of the Supreme Court decisions in 2016 that ruled against mandatory life sentences for those sentenced as youth. Freddie is married with 3 sons, 3 granddaughters, and 3 cats. Seems like you got a lucky number. He continues to work with criminal justice and prison reform programs, including coordinating a program called Meeting at the Door, which helps returning justice involved individuals transition back to society. Whew. Thank you all so much for your time and sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience with us today. And I will hand it over to the 3 of you.
All right, I think I'm the one getting it started, and I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it's all set up for that. Yep. Okay. Okay, there we go. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to do during our time is that we're kind of Howard, Freddie, and I will all be sharing different parts of the talk, and we're basically going to give an overview of the book and its goals. Howard will then kind of what was the motivation behind even starting this project and the one in the mid-90s that he did. And then Freddie and I will talk a little bit about our motivations for being involved, which were very different. And then some of the lessons that come out of the book, and then we'll open it up. While we're doing this, you'll see that the slideshow is going to show some of the pairings as we go along so that you can read some of those words in addition to the ones that are around you. We also will be playing a couple of audio clips of someone reading some of the interviews. It's not the person who's in the picture that's talking, but someone on the outside who agreed to do it. So just for broad strokes about an overview and the goals of the book is portraits and interviews with 22 men and women in Pennsylvania prisons who are serving life without the possibility of parole. They're paired so that you see a portrait of them from the mid-90s and an interview from the mid-90s that Howard did, and then a portrait and interview from 2017 when Howard went back in, and he'll talk more about that later. And as he was working with the newer portraits and interviews, he realized that they would really work well together, and that there was this longitudinal kind of approach to what he had, and can look at how are people coping when they're incarcerated, and particularly how do the people in the book from when they were in mid-90s to 25 years later, what has that experience been like for them? And so our goals with the book are to kind of give direct voice to folks who are serving life without the possibility of parole, to talk about what that experience is and see kind of what some lessons are that we can gain from that. And also hear their perspectives on criminal justice policy, and hoping that the reader is going to, think critically about this sentence of life without the possibility of parole, ask some questions, be pushed and challenged by the humanity that they can see in the people who are in the photos and their words. To get us started and to bring in that voice of someone who's in the book, I will play a clip of the 2017 interview with Yvonne Cloud. In her interview, she mentions someone named Peachy. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is right. She mentioned someone named Peachy, and Peachy, that's a nickname for Sharon Wiggins. She was in Howard's earlier book and was a real leader in her community, in the prison community. And so want you to know who she's referring to there.
I'm more outspoken and mature now. I found my voice and am able to express myself. I'm coping in a better and more positive way that will benefit me, as well as others in the community. Back then, when I was first interviewed, I was somewhat shy, still in denial, and didn't want to talk that much or let anybody know I had a life sentence. I still have the same determination to do positive things and give back to other people and change their lives for the better. I took a life. Now I try to save lives. Even though I'm here, I can still make a difference and guide other people in the right direction. Peachy was definitely an influence on me. She met me at a time when I was in my 20s, acting like a little kid, running around and doing the wrong things. I had all this potential, and Peachy brought that out of me. It was a sad day when she passed away on Palm Sunday. It was like the whole campus stopped because she inspired so many people. I spent years and years facilitating groups, everything I can grab, inspired by Peachy. I worked 10 years in the drug and alcohol therapeutic community. I recently became a certified peer specialist. I go all over campus helping the young offenders, letting them know that even though they're here, they can still make good choices and not repeat their mistakes. I go door to door in the mental health unit, inspiring and motivating people, letting them know there is hope. They can change. People have done it. I also work in admissions, so I talk to women as they come to the prison, letting them know about all the positive this institution has to offer. People come here and make things so much harder for themselves than it has to be. They come here with 2 to 4 years and end up doing the whole 4 years when they don't have to. It's all in the way we think. If you think positive, 9 times out of 10, you're going to do positive things. If you think negative, your behavior is going to reflect that. In 1993, I came close to getting my degree before they snatched away the Pell Grants. I had training for the hospice program. I worked in Project Impact for 5 years. I received the Lisa Wanger Award in 2004 for all the good things I've done as far as school. I received the Inmate of the Year Award in 2006. I've been doing a lot of positive things for a long time. Even though I don't know what the future holds, I'm determined to stay on the straight and narrow and continue to help other people. Pay it forward. Teach others what somebody taught me. That's what I do mostly, even on the weekends. These activities make me feel good about myself, knowing that I'm helping change other people's lives. I am very busy, but I make sure I get my rest. It's mandatory, or I wouldn't be able to do any of this. Most of the older lifers are mentors. You have some lifers, sad to say, who are still bitter, angry about their situation, like there's no hope. Then you have the ones like me, who just want to make the best of our situation and help others along the way. People ask me, "Oh my God, how do you ever do so much time?" I say, "Well, I have no choice in the matter. All I can do is the best I possibly can, take one day at a time, sometimes 1 second at a time, and keep my head up high and be as strong as I can, and give back to other people." I always remind my family that I'm strong and tell them all the things I do every day. I don't want them worrying about me. Some people go by what they see on TV. They don't know. They've never been here. So it's our job to let them know that we're okay. I try my best to keep them strong and let them know that I'm taking good care of myself. Thank God my son has never been in trouble. Doing life is in the library. It reached all over the campus. A lot of people really appreciate that. And a lot of them didn't know about life sentences. Some inmates walk by us every day and don't have a clue unless they sit down and talk to us. The book brought up a lot of people's awareness about life sentences and how we cope with it from day to day. It's taken me many years to forgive myself for the wrongs that I've done. I didn't have any right to take the life of another human being, and I have deep remorse for doing so. If I can turn back the hands of time and make a different choice, I would, but I can't. Today, I'm still suffering the consequences for my actions on that fateful day, 37 and a half years ago.
Howard, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good to be with you. Yeah, Barb suggested I say something about the history and of this book and motivation for doing it. Both of these books, and my career has been mostly around justice issues and especially restorative justice. And I'm also a photographer. I've worked part-time as a professional photographer, and I'm always trying to figure out a way to use my photography in the service of justice. And I try to do photography with the values and goals of restorative justice as well. Goals, values such as respect and so forth. One of the goals of restorative justice is to get us thinking about justice, talking about justice. And so I had moved to Pennsylvania in 1990, and I was starting to meet some lifers, and I had a lifer in Alabama who I'd worked with for many years. And he wrote to me one day and he said, you know, Howard, serving a life sentence is like trying to keep a candle lit in a dark tunnel. And I got to wondering, well, how do people who are facing a real life sentence, how do they think about this? They must have learned something through all this. And so I went into prison. I worked with the lifers to set up a sort of a little studio in there, and I interviewed people and did their photographs. And I talked to them about how they saw life sentences, what metaphors did they use to understand it. My goal was partly, I wanted to portray people without the usual stereotypes. You know, we have so many stereotypes about people in prison, and they are triggered if you see photographs of people with bars behind them and tattoos and all that. All of our stereotypes are triggered. I wanted us to have a discussion about real people with real people. And so I did these portraits and interviews, ended up being a book, Doing Life, that had got quite a bit of a circulation. And I'd always wanted to go back, but it was not, it's against the policies. And then a friend of mine had retired as the head of psychological services for the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania. And he thought this just had to get back in there, and he managed to arrange it. And so in 2017, I went back to the 22 that you see here, and I rephotographed and interviewed them, caught up with them, saw how they were doing, talked to them about how they were coping with life sentences, what they learned from life sentences, not thinking I had any way to make it a book. And then the new press became very interested, and Barb was willing to take the lead. Barb had worked in the Pennsylvania prison system. She and I worked together for many years. So we had a track record. And so we put together this book, and then the new press went on to get funding to make an exhibit from it. So it's been an exciting journey. I will say, I've also done a book about victims of severe crime and children who have parents in prison, trying to do similar kind of thing with the various people who get caught up in this tragedy. So is that enough, Barb? You want to add something on it?
No, that's good for now.
All right.
You can add more stuff later. People can ask questions. So yeah, Howard alluded to why I've been involved in the project. And whoops, I'm trying here to do slides and everything. And like you said, I worked for prisoner advocacy agency, Pennsylvania Prison Society, which also just happens to be the oldest nonprofit in the US. Started way back when Eastern State Penitentiary was just a glimmer in people's eyes. And so in the course of doing that work was, getting to know a lot of people in prison and getting to know a lot of lifers. I was doing restorative justice work for a good chunk of my time there, and restorative folks in prison, the lifers in prison were largely the ones that were pushing restorative justice inside. And so with that work, got to know a bunch of them. And so when Howard asked if I want to join him on the book, I was like, sure. I know a few people in the book from that restorative justice work. And quite honestly, you don't turn Howard down when he invites you to work on a project. And so I was really happy to get involved and really saw it as, knowing people with this sentence, this was a way to get involved and have some kind of a voice to get people thinking about the sentence. So it really was a work project, but also a project of love for the people that I knew and people that I want to get out. So that's why I got involved in it. Freddie, do you want to say a little bit about your involvement?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I missed Howard at Greater Ford when he began this book. I had been transferred to the State Correctional Institution at Huntington, and I got a letter from Howard asking me if I would be willing to share my experience. And having come in so young at the time where the prison really didn't offer anything. I came in 1971. This was before the first death penalty in Pennsylvania was abolished, and guys were still on death row. The sentence that I originally got was also eligible for the death penalty, even though I didn't get it. Like I said, I came into the prison where everything was very bare. So when Howard asked me to participate in the program, I was definitely honored to be able to have an opportunity to share the humanistic side of guys doing life. I can't say it enough. I went in real young. The opportunities that I got to get educated, to be involved in programs came from other lifers. The idea that most prisons will say that lifers are their best prisoners, that they're the backbones of the prison, they're more reliable and responsible. Yet, whenever the opportunity comes to have, I would say, sensible sentencing processes, sensible commutation processes, they don't get that. So, being able to talk about my experience, my being married, my having kids, my being involved in programs that elevated the mentoring that Yvonne alluded to, all these things are always done by lifers. Giving back to the internal community as well as the external community, having remorse about the damage in which they did in their communities. All these things was for me an opportunity to share, but not only that, to give the readers and even Howard, like with all of his experience, to actually hear the depths from which, people like myself had come, up in the system in spite of being locked down, in spite of not having any real help from the Department of Correction per se, to just elevate myself and find a way to give back, find a way to have another life, even in prison. You can have another life. It's oftentimes it's a tale of two cities, where guys come from and where they are now. having no knowledge or recognition of who they could be and what they have to offer, to understanding what they are and what they do have to offer. So that was my rationale, and that was my position for being involved in the book, and so much more. I mean, when Howard began the process, I thought he was going to do the article on men that had been married in prison, because I got married when I was in 1984. I met my wife through volunteer programs, and I originally thought that was the way we was going to go, and I was anxious about that. My wife is still with me. We have, as I was introduced, I have 3 grandchildren, 3 sons, and we have 3 cats. So, and you know, it would have been a wonderful story to tell about my wife and me, but this was just as good. And I really enjoyed doing life, and I enjoyed being a part of doing life 25 years later. Thank you.
Freddie's wife makes an appearance in the book, so get the book and check it out. There's a very sweet picture of them together in the book. So in the book, we have 22 men and women with interviews from the 90s and then again in 2017. And we wanted to take some time to kind of talk about some common themes that come across this diverse group of people, that even though their experiences are different because they're unique human beings, there are some similar themes. So Howard and I will talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to turn it over to Freddie to, you know, have him reflect on the lessons from life sentence. So to start, we're going to listen to the words of Craig Datesman, and the reason we're listening to him right now is he picks up on something that is a common theme across most of the interviews in some way. Okay, so hold on.
I'll be 64 in June. I'm working on 35 years inside now, and I'm taking it one day at a time. I realize how much faith I have and hope I had in the system 25 years ago, because I still had appeals in. When all appeals are dead, you start looking for something else to keep you going. It's a challenge keeping hope alive. Now I'm at the commutation stage. When I went up in 2014, I had good support, even the full support of the victim's family. But it was right at the cusp of the gubernatorial election, and I only got 1 vote after the merit review hearing. I'm trying again in a year. I'm hopeful. I could have taken a deal. They offered me a deal for 3rd degree, and the attorney said, 3rd degree is probably the most that you're going to be convicted of anyway, so I take the deal. It's up to you. This was right when they were picking the jury. I could have had 10 to 20 year sentence and maxed out 15 years ago. That pulls at me. I had no real interaction in the criminal justice system at all before, so I didn't have any kind of understanding of what it was. Even my victim's sister said that the district attorney told her, he's got a life sentence, but he'll be out in 17 years. After 20 years and I'm still not out, she started wondering why. Then another sister contacted the apology bank where we had sent the letters through the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. And she started to look up on the internet and saw articles I had written. The meeting with the victim's family, telling her what actually happened, was the best thing in my whole incarceration. She told me what the loss meant to her and was understanding of what it's done to me and how I've changed and grown. It's rewarding to know that even after 35 years, they aren't hating you, being vindictive or wishing you were dead. They're on my visitors list, send letters and cards, and written letters for my commutation. I did a TEDx talk about it in Graterford. The reconciliation program was really rewarding. It was funny how the fruits of something that you did 10 years ago come back so much later. They just kept growing. A life sentence is death by incarceration, different from having the death penalty where you know you're going to get it on a certain date. Here, you're just sentenced to die while you're living here. You really struggle to find meaning in life and get through day by day. The meaning of life is fleeting and fickle. It's all what you make of it. Meaning right now, my job is my job. I love computer programming. I love everything about it. I keep busy. I take part in programs like the Alternatives to Violence Project and the Lifers Organization. I finished my associate's degree. I worked in the dental lab for 5 years and 30 years in the correctional industries office. Programs like the reconciliation program and photography class give guys hope and a reason to get up and go forward. Once you get to a point where you're not doing anything, it gets a little melancholy. You can't sit around and do nothing. Everybody's anxious about the move from Greater Ford to Phoenix, the new prison. For all 35 years in, I never had a cellie, but at the new prison we're moving to, every cell's double. I'm hoping they'll let us choose our guys and I'll move in with an 82-year-old friend. I just want somebody who wants to be left alone. It's going to be a drastic change. I've grown a little bit more realistic as far as how tough the system is, no matter what your issues are in the court. I realize how important family is and how satisfying it is to help others, tutoring other people, being there, sharing your experiences with them. It's more satisfying than constantly worrying about yourself and what you're going to do next or accomplish. I think that comes with maturity.
So at the end of the book, there is a closing essay where we kind of take what are the big strokes, some lessons that we take away from the words from these folks. And what became clear as we were going through the transcripts is that, yes, we feel the weight of the sentence and the hopelessness and the despair. And at the same time, there is this strong theme of healing, of transcending the experience, and of really moving forward with one's life, even when things are staying the same. And we, in the closing essay, we kind of took the lens of trauma healing and kind of looking at all the different ways in which pathways to incarceration grow out of harm in various ways, and how incarceration is another layer of harm. But yet with all this, folks find their pockets of hope, find the ways in which to do meaningful work, to find out who they are at their core, engage in purposeful relationships, purposeful activities, and really transcend and deal and cope with all the things that came prior to incarceration and then also during their period of incarceration. Part of that definitely is around notions of accountability, remorse for what they've done, a desire to make things right, which for many of them is not something they've been able to do in such a direct way as what Craig Datesman has been able to do by talking with the people that they harmed. But even though they were never asked about how they felt about the crime that they had done or anything like that, and Howard can speak more to that later, many of them, if not majority of them, somehow come at that idea of having thought about it, what they've done, thought about the harm, wishing for ways to make amends and, kind of deal with that part of their life that they haven't yet been able to deal with. So even amidst the pain of the sentence, there are these amazing glimmers of possibility and opportunity and transformation and healing, which is really inspiring for their lives, but then also just inspiring for our own lives about what can we learn from these folks about the way we interact with people when we hurt them, when we're hurt, when we're in places of maybe not feeling hopeful. So there's really some universal themes that come out through their words. Howard, some thoughts from you?
Well, you've covered some of them. And one of the things that really comes through clear to me, a couple of things. One of them is just how do you feel human in such a dehumanizing atmosphere? I talked to a number of the folks just talked about the things they do to be human and to remind themselves that are human and to be taken seriously as a human being. Another theme that comes through really strongly is just the need to make meaning. Tom Martin, who was in the first book, Tom said to me, he said, you get up in the morning and I know you like coffee, you figure out where you're going to get your good coffee. He says, I get up in the morning and I ask myself, how am I going to make meaning this day? Because otherwise my whole life is meaningless. And so the struggle for meaning is a real clear theme that I heard. And a lot of times, as Barb said, that meaning comes in part by trying to do good. You know, I didn't ask people about the persons they'd harmed. I didn't ask them about their effort to pay back, but so many of them talked about that. You heard Yvonne Cloud talk about that. And it's the need to give back. Yvonne says, I can't undo what I did, but I can do things to make things better. So that's a real theme throughout. For me, I think just a reminder of how our quality of life depends on how we embrace adversity. You know, that how we move forward depends so much on whether we let things undo us, or whether we take them on and say, I can overcome this in some way. And what you hear are voices who over all of these years have found a way to grow, to make themselves stronger, to make themselves a kind of contributing human being in spite of all the limitations in that process. So those are some of the themes that strike me as I reflect back on the book.
Freddie, turning it over to you. You know, what have been the lessons from life? What are some of the things that stand out for you, including from the vantage point now of being someone who's out?
Well, for me, you know, it might sound kind of like a little crazy, but the prison experience for me going in when I first went in was all the older gentlemen, all the older prisoners that had pride in everything that they did. You know, they were clean, their clothes were clean, their manners was like, you know, uplifting, proud. You know, they had found themselves. They some of them made themselves over. You know, for lack of an expression, I would use the metaphor, a kid in a candy store. The prison system for me was a lot like that, because I didn't know anything. When I came off the streets, I didn't have an education. I had never experienced anything. So everything that I could learn, everything that these guys projected in their education, in their manners, in the way that they spoke, in the manner in which they had hope of something different. And a lot of them were lifers. Like I said, when they let the guys off of death row, that was another experience of men who had been locked away and discarded as not being valuable. They came out of the hole with educations in law, education in basic levels of schooling, math and reading. All that was on display for me, because as I said, the prison didn't have anything at that point in time. They were just building a brand new church, so we didn't have a lot of religious opportunities at that time. Everything was regimented. You know, you get up in the morning, you know, you stand outside your door until everybody came out. There was nobody allowed to be left behind in your cell. You went to the chow hall in an orderly fashion. You came back in the same order. You waited for, you know, work lines, and then you went out according to where you worked. Even when we went to the yard, everything was like single file. And when I just looked at these guys from a very young age, you know, like disciplining themselves, finding, one guy said to me one time, you want people not to say things to you in a derogatory way. He said, do what you're supposed to do. And whenever they speak, you don't have to worry about it being reflected on you. And I did that for a long time. You know, once I started learning that, I just did what I was supposed to do, go where I was supposed to do, be as responsible as I was supposed to do. Prison life became very easy for me. You know, I miss my family, no doubt. We all, you know, we miss our families under any circumstances. But the fact that I was now being given the opportunity to learn something, you know, to read. Oh man, when I read my first book, without stumbling over words, knew what I was reading, was able to conjure up the pictures of sentences, you know, whatever was being projected by the writer. I was thrilled. I was happy to share that with the guys that were tutoring me in writing, having me understand words, you know, using words that I could spell, you know. Like I said, the growing up process for me was a lot different than most, maybe most inmates, I don't know, but the most hardship that I felt about prison was not even that. I never even thought about dying in prison, but would I be able at some point get out and be able to use and give back to my community everything that I was now given the opportunity to learn, to develop and grow? Would I be able to do something with that other than in prison? And so, you know, that's the way it was. And that's the way it stayed for me, even though it took me from that point in time of over 49 years. I did exactly what I wanted to do out here in the free world. I built programs. I participated in programs. I got educated. I tutored. I facilitated drug and alcohol marriages, you know, marriage counseling programs that we did through other agencies. I started the Parent-Child Resource Center, and in Pennsylvania right now, every jail, as a result of what we did at Greater Ford with the Parent-Child Resource Center, every jail that was built from that point on had to have a place where family members and children could have quality visiting time and interact with one another through games and toys and coloring books and paintings. So, you know, like I said, maybe the last 10, 12 years of my life was not as pleasant as some things, but my growth and my development and what I was and the person that I became to be able to contribute to my community continued to be ongoing. And I think you done heard that in Craig and some of the other statements that were made about prisoners, just to drive to give back to their community and reconcile what it is that they did to, you know, to come, that one mistake that I think people make sometime, that bad decision that people make sometime. You know, these guys are constantly trying to rectify that. Yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Freddie.
Thank you.
Lana, why don't we open it up for some questions? Or whatever's next is planned.
Hear me? How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to make sure that we have time for opening up questions, but I just wanted to ask one question of each of you before opening up to that. So I wanted to start, first of all, thank you all so much for sharing all of that, for sharing your stories, for sharing your experience. I wanted to start with a question for you, Freddie. In thinking about what you shared both today as well as in this book about the significant impact education played in changing who you were and your sense of purpose. The quote you shared in the book, I just wanted to read it because I don't think I could possibly say this better than your own words. You said, "My life from all of this is that if you want to change a person who's lived the kind of life I did, you have to remove them from the environment where they're not learning anything. One of the downfalls of all the different times I'd been removed from society was being sent back to the same environment where there were not enough supportive mechanisms to keep old patterns from manifesting themselves. I had to start adapting once again to the lifestyle of the people I associated with, even to the point that it was good to be dumb. Without any self-identity, you succumb to that. So my question for you, based on this quote, was, is there a benefit to individuals being removed from existing environments to experience that transformation or rehabilitation? And if so, what could or should this model of transformation look like without the confines of a prison?
Yeah. Well, like even in prison, it was a different environment for me. Number one, the people that I was placed in prison with were older. I went into an environment at that time where Greater Fort had a population of a little more than 1,000 inmates. So everybody had their own cells. And the average age of the prisoner at that time was like 30-something years old. So these dudes were like a lot more mature than me. So that was taking me, even though it was taking me out of an environment of society, it would still put me in an environment that I wasn't in with kids my age, because I know how it was to be confined to juvenile places where everybody continued to do the same thing. Like your peer pressure was still constant. Well, at Greater Fort, when I went there in 1971, it was a luxury for me to be connected with older inmates, because the things they expected me to do was ultimately the things I wanted to do. I wanted to get educated. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be able to have get to a point where I can find my own identity, and feel confident in what I did. So that put me, education for me, and being groomed by these older inmates, and understanding that my confinement was not the end of my life, but it was basically the beginning of my life, and however I wanted to utilize it. So, having had that opportunity to really learn and grow and understand what I was doing, and being vital to my community, I would say that removing kids from their environment awfully gives them another opportunity to grow and expand in an environment where there is a support for those new ideas and those new experiences that they wouldn't normally get going back to their communities, or even back to the things where they're saturated by drugs and violence and abusive relationships, or not even knowing the value of relationships.
Thank you so much. The next question was for Howard, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what changes you saw through this project in particular over the course of these 25 years, either at the individual, cultural, or systematic level in regard to ideas of justice.
That's a hard question. Well, certainly over these years, there's been growing understanding of the limitations of our legal system. There's been growing, a wider sense. Restorative justice is one framework. There are others as well, but there's certainly been a growing awareness of the mistakes the system makes, the racism that seems to be built into the system, the way victims are neglected and re-traumatized. Those things, I think we've learned a lot about that. The individuals here, I've said something about that before, but the individuals here, almost everyone I talked to had really grown through those years, but it wasn't usually because the system offered them things. It was because they chose to just make the best they could of the situation to try to grow as much as they could in spite of the situation. And in some of those institutions, I mean, Graterford has quite a history of very mature leadership on the part of life sentence prisoners. In general, lifers are the most mature and the most stable of the population, but Graterford was particularly that way, I think. So not everybody gets landed in a situation where they have access to the old heads, is that the people who will take them under their wing like that. What else? Maybe that's enough for right now. But,
Thank you so much. All right, my last one is for you, Barb, before opening it up. So I had a question, I just wanted to read one of the closing paragraphs that you had in that final essay of the book and just hear your thoughts on your own reactions to these questions and if that's changed over time. So I'm reflecting back your own questions to you. So in this last paragraph around the idea of doing justice differently, you say, the exploration of trauma, including racialized trauma, restorative justice, and trauma healing, invites us to examine critically the role of life sentences in criminal justice policy and offers insight into how to do justice differently. If trauma is connected to aggression and violence, does it make sense to inflict a lifetime of pain and suffering to teach those who cause harm that hurting people is wrong? If the process of trauma healing offers a way to interrupt the cycle of harming oneself and others, and to create space for a justice process that better addresses harms and nurturing accountability, could justice be oriented around trauma transformation instead? Can a justice process oriented towards trauma healing and restorative justice address racism that undergirds society and fuels the criminal justice system? These are challenging questions, especially given our societal penchant for pain, punishment, and revenge. The portraits in this book help make the case that trauma healing and restorative justice offer us a path worth considering. So I'm just curious, your reflections on, I agree that these are some great questions, some hard questions, and just curious your own reflections and how, if your own ideas of this has changed over time.
No, I still think the questions are good.
Me too.
I'm just thinking, right now I teach in a criminal justice program, and I'm teaching an adult corrections class, and I taught it last quarter too. And one of the things that I have students do in the class is a quarter-long group project where they take a violent crime and they have to create a correctional response for it. And the first thing that I have them do, that we do in class, is look at correctional theories. And it includes kind of our typical ones of, retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. And then I've added into that, we do a week on trauma and trauma healing, and then a week on restorative justice, as these are other theories we need to start thinking about in the correctional process. And so engaging with students who are learning about this and wanting to go into the profession, how quickly they'll say, yes, restorative justice is the way to go. Yes. Oh my gosh, trauma healing. But yet not ready to let go of retribution, not willing to let go of incapacitation, and having trouble with trauma healing in the context of people who've harmed others. Very much there for those who've been harmed. And I think just spending the last 2 quarters with my students around that sort of stuff, it just really highlights the challenges of thinking about doing it this other way. And, what are the appropriate ways for some of those things that we have typically done for, decades, if not hundreds of years, of incapacitation or retribution, how they can fit really nicely with some of these other models like trauma healing and restorative justice, but yet are always in tension with them. And so, I think the subtext to those questions when I wrote them would have been, yes, we can do just trauma healing, and yes, we can just do restorative justice. But my students, questions they grapple with always reminds me that the answer is just really complicated.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pause here and open it up for any questions of folks here. Also maybe mutually, if the three of you, Howard, Barb, Freddie, if you have any questions for the folks in this room, like I said, this is a majority group of students and hopefully future justice leaders. And so the space is yours for questions.
Alana,
For anyone.
so there's a question in the Q&A that's really responsive to Barb's comments. So I thought you might want to get that one first.
Sure. There's a question in the chat that says, does restorative justice require letting go of incapacitation?
So there's two ways to answer that. The first one is no. I mean, we can look at even victim offender dialogues that happen inside prison while someone is having a period of incarceration. And then it gets more complicated then from there. So the answer is not going to totally come out fully coherent. So one of my favorite lines that Miriam Kaba has written, and I don't have it right at my fingertips, but she's like, to get rid of the prison industrial complex, it's not enough to say what's problematic about what we have and how do we change it. We actually have to ask ourselves the question of what do we imagine for ourselves in the world? Because it's in answering that question that we see the possibilities of a just community and a just world. And I really want to be always challenging myself to say, what do I want for the world? And I don't want prisons. And how do I situate myself in that so that the messages that I'm bringing to the world are challenging prison and not kind of sitting back and say, well, we can do this vision of restorative justice and have it exist alongside. So yes, it can exist alongside. No, for us to really transform, we need to do something different and not have prison part of that. Then in the middle, there's this thing of, even if we would not incapacitate people anymore in the way we do it with prison, the reality is sometimes we all need a break from being in relationship with other people. We all need a break from community, either because we're gonna hurt somebody or we're just gonna lose it and hurt ourselves. And I really wonder about what restorative justice and trauma healing say about where a break space might be, or a recuperation space, or that sort of thing. And so there might still be times where we separate people from community, but it's certainly not for life till you die. And it's not prison as we know it. It's not prison, not even just not prison as we know it. Is it trauma centers, that sort of thing? So I think it's a complicated answer to the question.
Thank you. Any other questions from folks in the group? Yeah.
Can they hear me?
I think so. These little dots are supposed to be microphones.
You guys
So
hear me? Because I don't think. But I work in restorative justice, and I'm in Vermont, where we don't have a lot of issues that are explicit with law enforcement, but there are issues with law enforcement here. And so we're always looking at this concept of transformative justice now, where we're not, we're kind of bypassing the criminal justice from the beginning. And so I would love to hear from you guys, just all of you, your thoughts on that complete bypass of the system and what your vision of transformative justice would be.
Anybody want to begin? Yeah.
That mean you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I have, you know, being a victim of you know, a long time of incarceration where I personally felt as though I should have paid for my crime, no doubt. I was remorseful for the crime, but the circumstances of the crime and the environment in which I came out of should have been more of a should have been more of a consideration of the overall crime. And that doesn't take place within our, you know, general society, where people might not think that the impact of your environment is a part of your crime. It really is, because in inner cities, and maybe across the country, I'm not sure, but I know in inner cities, there's no dealing with the impact of trauma that a lot of guys go through, and they transcend, you know, that transcends into their everyday living. These things need to be addressed at the core of one's incarceration. I'm like Barb. I don't think that you can have restorative justice where punishment is not going to be an issue, or confinement is not going to be an issue. But it can't, that's where it should begin. You know, eventually, when you give a guy a sentence, they're going to get out. And, you know, they say 85 to 95% of the people that are incarcerated will be returning to society. If you don't want to understand why people do what they do, the chance of them continuing to do that is inevitable until they themselves find a way to grow out of it. Because we don't deal with the trauma, we don't deal with the poverty, we don't deal with all the negative impacts of you know, society upon us, and what still goes on once you get into the prison. You know, we take parole, for instance. When people come up for parole, there's no community or family involvement really in that process. They're not bringing family members and other supportive agencies in and says, John is coming up for parole. Here's what John is going to need. Here's what John is going to do. You understand? Can you tell us if some of these things that John needs are going to be provided, and can you help provide it? Can you give him directions to where these things might be achieved? You know, and the process of coming out of prison right now, where guys don't have a clue about the technology in which to help them navigate this new world that they're coming out to, is just more, you know, more of the same. So if you're not willing to really dive into like helping a person understand what they're ultimately going to face and deal with what got them to where they are, then your problem is not going to be solved, period. Yeah, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, a truly transformative approach would have to start with addressing causes, and not just the responses to that. You know, it's hard to, I'd love to see that. It's hard to imagine it in the real world that we live in. The legal system does have some legitimate roles, and one of them is it should be protecting human rights and due process. That's an important role to be done somewhere. The problem is that there's so many self-interest and latent functions that the criminal legal system provides. Besides, you know, it's on the face of it, it's supposed to be fighting crime, suppressing crime, and so forth. But it's a whole industry. It's driven by a whole economic industry. It has all kinds of individual interests. It's a highly, the American legal process is considered one of the most politicized in the Western world, because prosecutors and judges, so forth, are elected. The model, the compromise model, and it's far from ideal, that has inspired me is New Zealand's youth justice model, which is designed, the idea is that let's keep the courts, instead of making courts the default where everything goes through, let's make courts the backup to be used when other things won't work, and to protect due process. And so with youth justice for serious crimes, you're not supposed to go to court. You're supposed to go to what is essentially designed as a restorative conference. And that person who runs it is not part of the criminal justice system. They're part of the social welfare system. And there's this, it was designed intentionally that that person not be a criminal legal system person. And so in New Zealand, you're supposed to go to a conference and you're supposed to work it out there and not just address what the person who caused the harm owes to the victim, but also what that person needs in their life so that they don't keep doing this. So the plan is supposed to have something for the person who's been victimized, and then what's going to be put in place to keep this person from doing it again. So in a sense that combines the best of the things, that it reserves the courts for when people just absolutely denying their guilt, when there are such offenses that have so many ramifications that it can't be just settled by individuals. And yet when they started this, I've been there many times, and I've had judges say that they used to spend every day, 5 days a week on the bench dealing with youth crime. And when this system went in place, they spent half a day or a day a week on it because they were being handled in these conferences. And furthermore, a lot more young people admitted their responsibility and didn't deny it because they knew they were going to a conference where they would have a voice, and where part of the effort would be to address what they needed. So it still engages a legal system, but to me, it's a kind of a compromise that might have some lessons for us. Barb, you look like you're ready to add something.
Yeah, I just, as the restorative justice field evolves, that I think that relationship between restorative justice and transformative justice is getting closer and closer and closer. And RJ isn't going to be successful without transformative justice, and transformative justice already kind of incorporates restorative thinking and processing into it. And so, I just think it's going to be the same old thing. And I think back to when I started in the 90s doing victim offender dialogue. It was just, you just did victim offender dialogue. It was this nice thing, repairing interpersonal relationships. But now you have to address the structural kinds of things that are going on. And I really appreciate Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon. I don't know if any of you have read that one, but her one chapter really is looking at policy recommendations. If we're going to have this more restorative and transformative approach, we have to look at things like prosecutor power. We have to look at police and police oversight. She, as well as Fania Davis, are clear we have to reckon with history of policing in the US, with police killings now, but also the reality of policing having its roots in slave patrols, and that until we're prepared to have that conversation, probably not going to have any change. And I think it's essential.
Yeah, I just want to add one more note. In this transformative justice, activity, you got to begin to set a balance in how you treat people, because a lot of guys in prison, they deal daily with how generally the criminal justice system is very for lack of another word, strange. In Pennsylvania, we have this double felony rule, where if you're in the company of a homicide, even if you didn't commit it, you get the same thing as the guy that pulls the trigger. Well, that doesn't sit well with a lot of prisoners who get involved in that, and then when they're in the system, they're angry and bitter, and they begin to take that anger and bitterness out on the people that are, watching over them, because, they feel as though they represent the harm, that's been done to them. I'm doing life, but I was asleep in the car when the guy that went in and got some cigarettes and killed somebody came out, and I didn't even know what he did. People don't get over those kind of situations, and that kind of bitterness, continues to churn while they're on the inside. So, this was the authority that they made the law, they made the sentence, they imposed the sentence, but they are doing nothing about, the differentiation of the person that's been caught up in this. And they don't, they don't want to recognize that. So a lot of it begins in recognizing the harm that is done to the prisoner, you understand, who really didn't do any harm to society other than being in the company of a friend. And so that's almost like being in jail for nothing. So so dealing with people on multiple levels to get them past their anger, to get them past their trauma, to get them past thinking bitterly about how unfair the system is a great part of that transformative thing that people, for me, like I said, I did a lot of time that I wasn't supposed to, but I chose to, take the perception that prison allowed me a certain amount of discipline to be a better person. So a lot of that was like a lot of my bitterness, if I was bitter, worked itself out through me being educated, worked itself out to me seeing as though I was constructing a better life for myself. A lot of guys are in that position, but then there's a lot of guys who aren't.
Thank you. I'm going to read one that came in from the chat. From Emily. I work in a public defense office as a mitigation specialist where I've assisted on many sex offense cases. What do you think we should do with situations like this? If someone is a habitual offender, what do we do to advocate? What do we advocate should be done to promote healing while also keeping people in communities safe? This is something I struggle with within my work.
I mean, I can start with two thoughts. First, the first thing that needs to be done is making sure that the people who've been harmed in those situations are getting what they need and prioritizing them and prioritizing their needs. And so even though you're based in defense, what is the relationship with the victim service community, the trauma and trauma healing community to ensure that that child, because you qualified there that it was pedophilia, is getting what they need. I think there's also, exploring what is the trauma history of the person who's doing that. Sex offending isn't my area of specialty, so I don't know kind of what the research is about where it comes from. In some communities, repeat sexual offending is coming from generational experiences and histories with that. So is that kind of history there for the person, and what does that mean for their need for healing? And then I'm also thinking about, there is the circles of support and accountability process that some communities are using, and it started with people who committed sex offenses in Ontario, where the person coming out, when they're still in prison, assuming they've been incarcerated, they join a circle of people who are their support circle and their accountability circle inside, but then especially when they go out, who kind of through relationships create safety around that person. They know what the triggers are. They know what the parameters of their parole conditions are. There's sometimes victim service providers sitting in that circle, but they kind of surround that person with the love and the humanity that they need to help keep them from offending again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jessica in the back. Oh, sorry, were you gonna add on to that?
Oh, no, I have a question. So if the panelists have more to say on that, I can wait.
Well, the only thing I would say and add to Barb is, right, that sex offenders don't need to be in prison. I mean, they need to be confined somewhere, of course, but a place where they can actually, once again, you know, I talk about this trauma because I done seen it so much and dealt with it coming up as a child, being put away in reformatories where, you know, there's a great deal, you know, of victimization. And there's a lot of that victimization is never, ever brought out. You know, the sexual, you know, the things that go on in youth reformatories and what have you, abuse by fathers, abuse by mothers, abuse by aunts. These things just continue to maturate among these kids until they're adults. And I'm talking about kids that I know, that I've seen some of this happen to. I confess that I started going to reformatory at the age of 9. And the only thing that I really ever had to deal with was anger issues. You know, I consider myself fortunate that I was not the victim of sexual, you know, activities with, you know, somebody forcing themselves upon me or me desiring to force myself upon other people. But I've seen that happen. And I believe that unless that kind of trauma is addressed and seen and rooted out, that some of these things that we contributed to sex offenders is never going to be realized. So you can't put them in prison because the trauma is going to consist through their isolation, through the harassment of other people finding out, some of them dying, getting killed in prison because of things like that. So I think, you know, you need to construct an area where there's a full-time address of this behavior and get to the root of it, where they can once again see themselves, you know, as not being victims, because, you know, victims often victimize. you know, we see it all the time. So, and that's a big part of that. So that would be, you know, from my experience of being in prison, from my experience of going through youthful reformatories, I think any type of prison environment where these things can't be addressed, that they can't share them among people, you know, that have similar experiences. You know, I treat it like church. You know, nobody is afraid to say amen in a church, you know, but on the street, you might have, you know, depending on who you're around, if something moves you to that way, your amen might be a little, oh yeah, amen, you know, but not so everybody can see it and join in.
Barb mentioned the perspective of those who've been victimized, and that's really important thing to take into account. You know, it was interesting when Pennsylvania started its dialogue program for severe violence, that is, for people, victims of severe violence, who's the person who had committed it was in prison, could ask to meet with them through a facilitated process, and they were going to disqualify any kind of sexual offending from that. Well, victims of sexual offending were beating their doors down. I mean, Barb and I are both involved in that program. I think a high percentage of the people victims who asked to go through that are victims of sexual offending. And that tells you something. It's just there's some real needs that victims have that can be can be addressed in some ways through a restorative process, and that needs to be an important part of our thinking.
Thank you. All right. I know Jessica Brown has a question, and we'll see where we're at on time after that.
Okay, thanks. Barb, earlier you talked about how your students were enthusiastic about trauma healing and restorative justice, but also couldn't let go of retribution and incapacitation. And I think that in the United States, it's part of the reason that it's easy for a lot of people to have strong opinions about punishing people by putting them in jail is because a lot of those same people have never been inside a jail or a prison to see what it's actually like. And so my question is around, I have this inner conflict. I think that it's important for people to see what it is actually like in prison, especially anyone, frankly, who is going to be in the criminal legal system, working in the criminal legal system, putting people in jail, should be required to see what it is like in jail or in prison. But that feeling is in conflict with concern about adding to the dehumanization of people who are in jail and prison. And so my question is for all three of you, but mostly for Freddie, about how you feel, how it felt to you, how you feel about the idea of essentially people coming to quote unquote tour jails and prisons.
Well, I mean, you know, first of all, I think it's a good idea. Not so much for just the seeing, but for them to be able to sit, you know, like in groups and talk to inmates, you know, about what's really going on. Because see, here's the idea that most people have. They don't see a lot of people reforming their lives, you know, and they need to see that. They need to hear that. They need to talk to guys, you understand, that never had anything, that or had a bad sentence, or can make sense out of a question that somebody in society has about the prison, you know, environment. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. You know, I met my wife, you know, through coming into prison to help. We worked together. We fell in love, which was quote unquote against prison policy of interaction and caring about inmates and stuff. Some of my best friends were professors that came in and brought students in to talk to us about how prison was, and gave us educational programs and gave us tutors, you know, to come in and help, and child caring. I mean, there's just, you know, when people see the need, they respond. But you know, you just send them, walk them down the hall and say, you know, yeah, that's a block there, and you know, that's the school there, and that's the chapel. That does very little. You know, yeah, they might be in awe. I mean, I was in awe when I first went to prison in Greater Ford, where the hallway was a mile long. You know, and over the years, it was like, let's say 4 city blocks. You know, when I went in, well, when I left, it was like 2 city blocks, you know, long. And that's what you got to understand, that when people have the idea of getting familiar with something, they see things a lot closer up. You know, they see things more objectively than subjectively. So yeah, I think it's a great idea for people to be able to come in prison, but not just to look. They need to be able to talk to the inmates, and those inmates that are involved in doing things within the prison, so they can have a much broader understanding of what's really going on.
Yeah, both Barb and I have had experiences of taking classes in and meeting, sitting with groups, sitting with lifers and learning together. Barb, you've done it as part of a program. You want to say something about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I share the tension on tours.
Yeah.
And for myself personally, I'm at a point where I go on a tour because I'm part of some organized group. I'm like, oh, I should have remembered to pull myself out and not do it. I have taught a class some of you might be familiar with it, Inside Out Prison Exchange. It might even be somewhere there and going on there in Vermont where a college class is taught inside a jail or a prison, and you bring students from the local college into the prison for the class, and incarcerated folks are in the same class as co-learners. And you actually develop relationships and friendships with the folks that you're taking classes with. And it's very different than when you're just going in and looking. But one of the risks, I think, though, with having, for some people, if they see, oh, people do transform here, they do change their lives around, see, prison's working. So there's always that kind of flip part too, that I agree. If we're going to go in, we have to be in conversation as equals. But I worry that it's also potentially lead to messages of it's a good thing. And even with the book, yeah, it's good that so-and-so was in 35 years because it took him that long to actually acknowledge what he did. Well, that's not the point.
No, it ain't the point.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. Thanks to those of you who took the time to be here today and those of you who are joining online. I just want to close us out if the three of you have any final words or thoughts you want to share with the group. No pressure.
Freddie, you got anything?
Well, look, my statements are always the same. Anything that you can do to get involved to make the criminal justice system a little more responsible to those whom they're confining, to put in circumstances and situations where all the time that a person has might not be appropriate, that recognize that people begin to change, and maybe even understand that a lot of, I would say the vast majority of individuals that are in prison, irrespective of the crimes that they committed, it was just that one bad decision. Some of these people are not habitual criminals. They responded irrationally, and you'll find that the majority, at least when Miller came out, very quickly, when Miller came out and released over 200 and something prisoners from Pennsylvania under not being able to give juveniles life without the opportunity of parole. They're out here right now, involved in their community, involved in other programs to enrich their community, to deal with the gang violence situation, to deal with housing, to deal with changing of the law. These guys are working because they made one bad decision, and they came out, and now they're showing that they are productive, and they did have a lot of potential, you understand, to give back to their communities. And that's what you might want to, if you have any influence at all in looking at the criminal justice system and how it reacts, and how you can change some of the laws that are a little archaic, in the way in which they confine people, please get involved.
And I'd like to, if it would be all right with you, Freddie, I'd like to read something from your interview, because my very favorite quote in the whole book is by Freddie. And it really speaks to just the gratitude we all should have that we're not incarcerated for life in prison, and be grateful for the everyday things. Freddie, do you mind if I read your?
No, be my guest. Thank you.
Okay. A good thing about being out is that I can get up in the morning and do whatever I want. Just the normal everyday things that you never thought about doing, and now you can do. I sit on the porch and take in the air, make coffee for my wife or breakfast, lay in the bed a little later if I want. If you want to go somewhere, you just go. It's a new way of living, a life that I didn't know I could have. If you have never been without it, then it's hard to imagine how it actually stimulates your psychological palate. For me, this is like the first fruit that I've ever had, and it's quite delicious.
Amen.
And, you know, most people in prison, many people in prison want us to know that they are more than that one act that they committed. Most people who are victims of crime want you to know that they are more than just a victim. So it's just really important that we see people as whole people, no matter, and try to avoid these labels and stereotypes as much as we can.
Hey, yes.
Some amazing closing words. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.